Well, can you believe it? It's almost all over. We've had 3 days full of amazing content delivered by people with experience from all over the world. It's wonderful to be able to have heard what's worked, what's haven't worked, and how, as a collective, we can learn from one another to evolve our practice. Hopefully, you guys know us by now. If not, then I'm Helen Garcia. This is Ines Garcia, my co host, and we have been here for your Agile Online Summit 2022. We have now our last keynote, so buckle up and get ready. Remember that we are using Slack for our community hub for all the sessions, conversations, and connections. So if you haven't yet, then pop over to Slack. There should be a link in the email comms that you've received, and you can get involved in some of the conversations there. Remember, we've got 6 channels. They are all active, and they will continue to be for your future networking, which is very exciting. So get stuck in to meet your peers, share knowledge, learnings, give a big virtual high five and a shout out to those talks and those people that have really impacted your learning over this week. So over to you, Ines.
Thank you. So yes, this year's summit motto is all about evolving our practice. And I have come across the work of our closing keynote speaker through biomimicry, which is the practice of applying nature almost 4 billion years of evolution proven strategies in our designs. And the question of what makes superorganisms super. And mostly, how do we use these strategies at scale? We wanted to bring something different, insightful, food for thought, and yet tangible in the applications in the work that we do. And as our keynote speaker says on her book, Teeming, when a select group of people in charge of choosing which genes and ideas other people ought to have, it's a toxic recipe for human suffering. Conscious evolution is a powerful idea, but you can't presume you know where others want to go with their future. And this is highly relevant. Tamsin, thank you for joining us here at the Agile Online Summit. It's wonderful to have you. I am chuffed. So everyone sit back, open your heart and minds to be taken on a journey by an evolutionary anthropologist, CEO at Team Lab and Dean of Geoversity School for Biocultural Leadership. Without further ado, I welcome to the stage Dr. Tamsin Woolley-Barker.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. That is actually one of my favorite quotes in the book. So you honed right in on that. So yeah, this is going to be a little different than what you normally hear. It is going to be agile, but it's the way that nature does it. So I'm going to share my screen here for you and let's get started. Right. So we're going to talk about how nature's teams stay agile. So agility, we talk about this all the time, but what is it really? It's the capacity for nimble and effective sense and response. So we're doing this all the time in our work, but we're also constrained by this thing called scaling up. We have this imperative to scale up. We want to figure out the best thing, the best numbers, and scale it up to that so that we can have more profit and impact. So how do we do that? Typically we analyze the system, we're breaking it into parts, and we're testing and maximizing all the components, and then we standardize and scale up to that, right? That's efficiencies, Lean Sigma 6, all the things that we do. And then we have to predict and control to make that work. But whose predictions and ideals and assumptions are we actually using here? So this in your work, it might be the best number for someone's efficient extraction, but it might not be the right number for yours. And it might not be the right for the customer. And it certainly might not be right for the larger society that's emerging from these things. So what do we get when this happens? It ends up being we work in silos. It gets fragile. We're trying to fix things all the time. So it gets complicated because you fix one thing and you have to fix the problem that comes from the fix, right? And it gets expensive and complicated, and there's unintended consequences. And then, you get disengaged. You feel like you can't make a difference, or that things are just happening to you. So you lose your creativity and care. So that's the state that we're in, and then when you do that, you actually prevent future flexibility. So it gets tighter and tighter and tighter, and there's less play in the system until it breaks. So what do we do when that happens? And I think we're in this phase right now where we're reacting to this. So we're downsizing, we're restructuring, we, issue directives. Okay, everybody, we're going to change the way we're doing this. Total transformation, right? And we tell people what to do, and even maybe threaten them or give them great rewards or whatever we do. But increasingly, we're putting more regulations and fixing these nodes so they cannot move. So we're really taking the flexibility out of the system. And then what do? We say, well, if only they knew, if only they had the education, if only they could see it my way, our way, they would know. And so that's what we get into. So, but the fundamental root of this is that the organizational structures and processes that we rely on as best practices are actually restraining our natural capacity to adapt and thrive. This is happening all the time. And we just take it for granted. We think, oh, this is real life, right? Like, get realistic. This is real life. But real life doesn't work that way. So here we have all these diverse species and all this kind of life coming out. We're all related to them. It's all one spark of life 3.8 billion years ago. So all of us are survivors, right? We all got here. Our ancestors got us here. And we have this natural capacity within us to do these things. So, but what's our solution space? It's science, technology, engineering, math. It's this kind of thing. But if you look at these logos, I just did a Google for these logos to see what they look like. But what's missing from them all? Not a single one of these has any living thing in them. So how are we going to solve our problems when life isn't even considered? And further from that, from that premise, you can see that leaders are blind and illiterate when it comes to the way life works. And now we're seeing, if you look in the Harvard Business Review, you see that all these biological metaphors, ecosystems and even artificial intelligence, which is neither one. But, we're going towards these biological metaphors. But the reality is that these are remaining in the metaphorical sphere, that our leaders are really blind and illiterate when it comes to the way that life actually adapts. And why is that? Your MBA doesn't require a single biology class. Your economics degree, not a single biological class. And yet everything we do is biological because we're animals. So what a blind spot. And so thinking further into this, as an anthropologist, you realize that these standard operating procedures that we take for granted were actually imposed on our ancestors to extract their community wealth and labor. That's the situation we're in. And it goes back. It doesn't matter who you are. This is true. The Romans, before that, it's been this slow process of being extracted in our communities. And here we have the results of that is that we operate in these systems that are really not serving us as human beings. So it's become a kind of mission to take what I've observed in the living world and in different species and in humans, and to try to rehumanize our life and work so that we can bring out the potential that we have naturally within us. I mean, all our ancestors got us here, so we got the goods just as much as any other animal. But what is it going to take to rehumanize our life and work? So, if Donella Meadows, the highest leverage points on these kinds of changes are just the processes in which we work and the structures in which we live, but above all else, the paradigms through which we understand the world. So if you're looking at those STEM logos, that's the paradigm we're looking at the world through. It's effective efficiency, extraction, and control, but not the living world that we're part of. So of course we get the same degrading systems that we started with. It just keeps repeating. So we need to see with fresh eyes. And this is my son, and notice that he's looking with a lot of different eyes. It's the plurality of perspectives that allows you to see the system and see it from all perspectives. So when we have this predict and control model, whose eyes are we looking through? For what perspective? For what outcomes? And I think we need to get much more intentional about this. So my journey to this kind of thing is, I was just a kid going, what kind of animal are we? Now, this is my son. I don't know what kind of animal he is. This is my older one. But I got my start with Jane Goodall because I was so enamored of the way that she humbled herself and she went into their world. She didn't say, okay, I'm going to the zoo and I'm going to study these guys. She said, what is it going to take to earn their respect and their trust to come to me and share that world with me? And so she did that. And that made a big effect on me as a kid. And that's really what I wanted. And I wanted to know, like, here's our closest relatives. And they shed so much light on our own nature. So that was really my guide in my career. And so I was obsessed with living things. I worked in all kinds of field situations, looking at the way that evolutionary patterns work, life's deep patterns. And then I got really interested. So once I figured out the way that life is adapting to change, I wanted to know, what is it about humans that makes us special? And I thought it had to be our big brains. So I actually went and lived on a fishing boat, like a deadliest catch crab boat in the Bering Sea with 25 fishermen, studying whales to see if I could understand how their societies work and how their big brains were helping them do this. But what I concluded was that it wasn't the big brain. It wasn't our big brain that makes us what we are. So I started studying, cognitive evolution in humans. And pretty quickly, I could see that it wasn't the brain. It was their societies. So I actually switched my work into looking at these baboons. So I was living in Ethiopia in a tent, a very remote area of Ethiopia, and studying these different baboons. And they were two very different kinds. And they had very different social structures. And the results were very apparent. That one of these species had evolved much faster than the other. So I could see that it was their social structure that had allowed them to adapt to change much faster than the other species. So that's something that just stuck in my mind. And on thinking about it further on, I came to the conclusion, some answers about what is human nature. And so our chimpanzee and bonobo closest relatives are very much, their societies run on dominance, right? It's really each one is out for themselves. They do have caring relationships and all this, but in the end, it's every chimpanzee for themselves. But humans are not like this. There's been a fundamental shift in our social structure where we are fundamentally dependent on each other in a deeper way. So where chimpanzees are out for themselves, we help each other, we share with each other. The clothes on your back, did you make them? You know, the food you made, your latte, how many people were involved in getting that to you today? And so we're fundamentally dependent on each other in this way. So we are super organisms, more like ants and honeybees. So that's a radically different way of thinking of our social structures. And so we know that, like, babies, even babies, pre-verbal babies, can understand fairness instinctively. So if you show them a plate of cookies and you share them unequally between two older siblings, the baby looks at you like, oh, what are you doing? They already know that. And if someone needs help and they see that and you don't help them, oh, what are you doing? So that's instinctive in us, and the other great apes don't have this. 75% of the food that foraging peoples eat is not caught by their immediate family. They're catching food for each other. This is very different than chimpanzees. And then the real diagnostic here is that we share half our childcare on average globally which is really weird because the other grade 8 mamas do all their own childcare. So this is a fundamental difference. And these are all diagnostic characteristics for superorganisms that are more like, ants and bees. So I started thinking about this, and the other thing is, if you look in the fossil record for humans, you see that we were really taming one another. We removed the most aggressive individuals, or we favored mating with the kindest, most generous individuals, and that now humans are very generous and kind and polite, and we can even ride on an airplane together without tearing each other's throats out mostly. So it's only sociopaths and the most dominant individuals that are still openly attempting to rule through force and fear the way that chimpanzees always do. It's a fundamental change. So we are superorganisms. And so what is a superorganism? It's a colony of individuals that are independently perceptive and creative, and they fundamentally depend on one another. So it's not a clone army like we think of ants. This is, every individual is unique and distinct, but they do better by working together. And so there's been selection for this kind of superorganism society in us. So that's our nature. And yet here's where we work. So the way that nature, here we need all these changes made. I mean, we have so many urgent changes we need to make, and things are getting more volatile all the time. And how are we supposed to adapt to them when we have this kind of system? So it's a hierarchical system. And what does hierarchies in nature do? We see them all the time. They do occur in nature, but they're for preventing change. So sometimes, all the time, cancer cells are arising in our bodies, but a hierarchical immune system is going and finding those and removing them. So that's a hierarchical system for preventing change. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But that's not the case for us. We have a lot of problems, a lot of situations, and a lot of volatility. We need to be changing all the time. So here's these two models that we've been operating in. Resilience and innovation. These are Native American corn. You can see the diversity in all these kernels. And that's what gives them the resilience. If there's a disease comes, we know with the potato blight, the diversity is what maintains the resilience. And yet we're operating in this efficiency model where we control, we predict, we efficiently extract based on that one number. So you get these monocrops that are vulnerable to parasites and lack the potential for change because there's no diversity in the system. And not only that, but people just don't like it. They don't like feeling coerced and limited in their creativity and agency. And they don't like having change done to them. I mean, people always say, well, people don't like change, but that's not actually the case. People are naturally adapted to change, but they don't like having it done to them. And they don't like being made to work with people they don't trust or like, and in our normal, traditional societies, you would just walk away from people like that. But we don't have that option in our work. We work for who the boss tells us, and we work doing the projects the boss tells us, and we have to work within the constraints of that system. So, for me personally, I got to that point in my scientific career, and I wasn't able to get to the ideas that I wanted to get to within that constraint, because I knew that here as a biologist, life is more than the sum of the parts. But in the work world and in the academic world, I was constantly forced to sort things into parts, analyze, break down, maximize parts. And so I figured I couldn't get where I wanted to go through this. And so I got out of the workforce. I had my own business, entrepreneur. And then, a series of life events, I came back to my biological passions, and I started writing this book, or this manual called the Biomimicry Manual, for a magazine. And it was picked up, and it did very well. And I was able to kickstart a new book and all these things. And so that led to all these jobs with these, canopy kind of companies. And so really making a difference on the high level. And I was very excited to bring in these notions of agility and what I knew about living things and adaptation. And so every single time we did these projects, these biomimicry projects, they were totally transformative. The engineers would get so excited. Everybody would be excited. It would be like game-changing things, But then what would happen is I would find that the companies were really not able to use the potential in these things to the degree that they could have. And the reason was because of these structures. They're simply not structured for innovation. They're structured for efficiency. So at some point, they weren't able to do these things. The living systems that we were trying to bring in were fundamentally opposed to the efficiency structures that they were working in. So, and they would get frustrated. We'd see the engineers get frustrated, disengaged, people would quit their companies. So we weren't doing them favors with that. So I started thinking, well, how does nature actually adapt to change? How does nature actually transform? So I wrote this book, Teeming, and I was looking at, okay, if we're superorganisms, how are these other superorganisms adapting? How are they staying agile and resilient and innovative and doing all the things that we want to do? And so, chimpanzees, they are agile, right? They're agile in the trees, but they're also agile as individuals. They're sensing and they're responding and they're reacting and they're very clever. But if you really want to increase that sense and response, that's the foundation of agility. You see a model more like the octopus. So here's this octopus, and it is actually as intelligent as a macaque baboon, which is pretty wild, has the same number of neurons, but they're not in their brains, they're in their skin. And so what they've done is moved the central administration to the forefront of their skin. So each of these receptors is paired with the response. So the reception actually moves to the front lines and the response. And so that gives them this great, flexibility, agility. You think of the octopus, right? But going forward, even more than that, is the bees and the ants and these superorganisms. Because what they're doing is they have many eyes and minds, and they're bringing them all together to create a collective intelligence and a collective awareness, collective agility that is much more powerful than what one chimpanzee can accomplish, or even one octopus. So if you look at this, okay, here we are, superorganisms, and you can see some of these pictures are social insects, and some of them are ours, our own buildings. But this signature of intelligence, intelligent design is upon them all. To me, I mean, if we were Martians and we went and looked at our planet, we might think, oh, maybe the ants are little people, or maybe the people are big ants, because it's a similar kind of complex structures that we are creating. But now look how much better at it than they are than us, because here's these leafcutter ants, 0 hours in traffic. And then you look at the Netherlands, 70 million hours stuck in traffic. So that's not agility, right? But these ants are doing that. And then what's the amazing thing about that? Nobody's telling them what to do. It's the structure. That's their strategy. So this is a slime mold. And as I increasingly went into this kind of study, I started seeing these deep patterns in far more than just ants and honeybees. I started seeing it in slime molds and fungal networks underground. There's a number of species that use these kinds of patterns of collective intelligence to achieve the same things that we're trying to do. So I started looking at what those deep patterns are. And you can see here's a slime mold that is in a petri dish, and it has 2 real modes. So one is it doesn't know what it doesn't know. So it's exploring. And when it finds something, it conveys back to the main body, everybody over here. And so then you get a very efficient extraction of that resource. So they have the best of both worlds. It's very adaptable. And so I started thinking, what if our organizations were more like slime molds without the slime? So how does that work? Well, they're adapting to change quickly. They're resilient to risk, and they're innovating instantly to take advantage of new opportunities. They don't restructure, they just split and fuse, and it's a very natural process. And they don't have any meetings or management or expenses, no annual reviews, there's no corruption, and there's no paperwork. Oh, to be a slime mold. So what is this deep pattern? I started thinking about this. And a scientist probably wouldn't overgeneralize to this extent, but in my life, working with companies, I can take a little bit of liberty and overgeneralize and look for these deeper patterns. And it's been very interesting because they really are these fractal patterns in our world. So what are these superorganisms doing? They have many eyes and minds, and they're gathering this value, these little specks of like little scraps of leaves or little bits of molecules of water and nutrients in the soil. The honeybees are gathering pollen, but it's little things. And so they're bringing it together and they're gathering it, and they do it all in different ways, different independently ways. And then they're upcycling it through these symbiotic relationships. So like the leafcutter ants and the termites, they have these fungal gardens underground. And so they're going out and they're bringing all these chewed up bits of leaves to the fungal gardens as a compost. They're actually feeding these things underground, and they eat the mushroom fruit that's coming off these fungal gardens. And similarly, the honeybees are working with bacteria to ferment into honey. Mycelial networks are working with trees to exchange sugars. So it's a deep pattern. And so, but what also happens is then this value, this concentration of wealth, draws all kinds of symbionts. So it's other species that we work with, or that they work with. So the leaf cutters are working with the fungus, but also other symbionts are coming and breaking down that value all the time and keeping it in the territory. So the territory gets richer and richer. Well, we don't do any of this, So what happens is the territories are worth defending, because they're actually not just their value is in it, but all the relationships that produce the value. Is all of their trees and their symbionts and their fungus and all these things. It's a system. So that's a general pattern. And what's amazing about this is that nobody tells them what to do at any point. This is, they're diverse individuals, they're doing what they want, they're independent, and together they're bringing together this collective value. How do they do that? Well, they're all making small, imperfect decisions, and they're course correcting correctly, constantly. They don't know what they don't know. They're just going to the best next possibility. And so really it's the structure is their strategy. And that's what we'll see. So when we're looking at agility and how nature's teams achieve it, these are some of the deep patterns by which they do it. And so this is a framework that I've come up with to describe that deep pattern that we saw of the superorganisms going out, collecting small particles, and they're gathering it together. They find those through collective intelligence, independent individuals searching, but then they collect it through swarm creativity, which is teams, a team of teams. So each of these teams is specialized on something else. And together they have a much broader range of possibility, and it makes them very agile, very resilient, and very innovative. And so what they're doing, they're collecting these raw resources, these little particles, and they're symbiotically upcycling it. And you can see that there's the relationship between the symbiosis and the raw resources, because the raw resources have to be replenished by that cycle. And that's why those symbionts are breaking it down and keeping it in the territory. It's replenishing this cycle. So as this cycle goes over and over again, the community gets more and more specialized to the place, and it gets more and more shared identity and purpose. And while that's happening, the outer environment is getting richer and richer and diversifying and creating more potential and more opportunities. So as companies, we're usually focused on that this horizontal line, this collective intelligence and swarm creativity. Functional, right? How do we function to, get the greatest profit and impact? And so we really focus on this, and not so much on this symbiotic upcycling, and generally not so much on this community identity. We just want to get these resources, and this is how we do it. So, but if you look at these superorganisms, there's 5 teeming patterns, what I call teeming patterns, that reveal a hidden potential in our lives and work, because we're superorganisms, and we've evolved with the same kind of pattern, but now we've kind of lost our way on that. So it helps us to look at these deep patterns and compare them to our own lives and work, and see where there might be deficits, where there might be potential that we could work on. So I've taken this framework and then specialized it towards our own work in our organizations. And so what are we doing? We've got collective intelligence, diverse and unique and independent individuals going out and doing their things. They're working in teams, and together they're gathering those raw resources. And that is what feeds the colony. But to replenish it, they need to regenerate and co-create and co-evolve future possibilities. So this is the piece that we just drop off. So collective intelligence is what allows them to do all these amazing things without being told what to do. So you might have heard of honeybee democracy. So here's how they make decisions. So these honeybees, let's say they need to find a new home. So what do? They actually, the scouts, go out in all different directions looking for places. And when they find one, they'll test it out. Is it big enough? Is it safe enough? All the things they need. And then they fly back to the hive, and they do a waggle dance. They do this little dance. It's a figure-8 dance. And it actually tells the other bees what direction to go for this new home, how good it is. And if they like it a lot, they'll do a lot of dances. And so other bees are more likely to see it. And if they see her vigorous dance, they'll actually use her little code to tell where to go and how far, and she'll go and check it out for herself. Now, bees will never vote for a site they haven't seen themselves. They don't share the news without reading it. So, and they don't go for fake news either. But what these guys do is, so it ends up, they'll come back and they'll do this dance, and then more bees will see the dance and fly out for themselves to check it. So what you get is this noisy dance floor of bees dancing for different sites. And they're all going at once, kind of an honest competition. But at some point, because those better sites are seen by more bees, because she does a more vigorous dance, those sites amplify and the poorer ones fade away. And at some point, there's a tipping point, and the whole hive will fly to the new site. And so that's how they make decisions. And that's, you compare this to the way that we choose our leaders, through elections and things like this. We might look more at something like this. And here's the ants. They use similar kind of means where if they find food, they'll drag their abdomen along the ground and create this trail. And so other ants that are wandering around come across it, and that tells them there's food in this direction. So they'll go do that. When the food runs out, the trails run out. They dissipate. And so it's these behavioral shifts that occur in this way. So there's really no consensus. It's a tipping point, quorum sensing kind of process. And they use these stigmergic signals. So here we are, hey, I need you to do this. I need you to do that. That's not what they're doing. They are simply laying tracks in the atmosphere, in the environment that trigger others going, okay, this is what's happening. This is the big picture. How could I help? How could I join in? And so it's much more like this. And then these simple rules and tipping point shifts that you see, like with the honeybee democracy. Like everyone's doing this very simple thing. They're having an honest competition of ideas, and then there's tipping point shifts that just determine it. And the crazy thing about the bees is 85% of the time they choose the best home. So this is a very effective process, but it's also very low computing power. And it's a great solution to things like the traveling salesman problem. So then let's get into this swarm creativity. So what's going on these teams? They're leaving little seeds of ideas. A termite might put a little blob of sand on a wall, and that triggers others to put a blob of sand next to it. And maybe if there's 5 blobs in a row, they switch to making arches. And so again, it's this tipping point trigger system that has these cascading effects. And very complex things can happen through these means with nobody telling anyone what to do. It's just the way we like to work. So some of those deep patterns for collective intelligence that we can be thinking about in our own organizations is, well, obviously shared purpose comes right to the fore, as they're self-organizing around the shared purpose. And they can do that because the shared purpose is really deeply inherent in them. They're doing multiple parallel low investment experiments all the time. And some are, amplifying and some are decaying. So that's something we could be doing in our organizations. And we're facilitating these always on conversations. You mentioned the Slack channel. That's our Slack channel right there. And then these simple if-then rules, which we can begin designing. So what's required for this collective intelligence to go to work? Well, the individuals have to be diverse. And we think of them as a clone army, but that is not the case. It turns out that no 2 ants are statistically alike. Like they're more different than we are from one another, which is crazy. And I've talked to ant researchers that can identify individuals by their behavior. So this is a myth that we have. So they're very diverse. They're all independent. They communicate transparently, and they have this body of shared rules. And that enables them to do these very complex things. So how could we cultivate this kind of thing in our own organizations? And more mentorship and development and education, just helping each other. And then, experimenting, tinkering, hands-on experience. And of course, that's the foundation of Agile technologies is this, try again, rapid prototype. And then, but if everyone's got to be diverse and independent, you also have to have the psychological safety for humans. We've got to have that belonging. Otherwise, people don't speak, they don't contribute, and then you don't get the collective intelligence. You get, more of the same. And then the other thing is this idea of belonging that we're so lacking. We need to cultivate this idea of we're a we and you're special. We need you uniquely and you're one of us. And so those are things that we just miss in our lives so much. I think so many people are feeling a lack in these things. But this is really the root of the collective intelligence that allows us to do these things together. And you have to share the costs and benefits equitably. That's a major sticking point for us in our organizations because some of us are getting 350 times more than somebody else, right? So, that the bees aren't doing that. The queen she's not a ruler. She's not getting more than anyone else. She just has her own job. So here we are, we've focused on this collective intelligence and this swarm creativity, very functional things. And it's all about getting these particulate raw resources and feeding that organization again, or that shared identity. And again, we're really neglecting this symbiotic upcycling. So how do we do it? We do it in these team of teams. And that's the way we like to work too, these team of teams. But if you've ever worked in a high performance team, you know that you don't tell people what to do. There's no control. You are growing individuals' capabilities and becoming really aware of what their strengths and weaknesses are. And then there's a lot of communication of, hey, I'm open, I'm here, maybe some strategy, but basically everyone shares the purpose. And so they know what to do on their own. So the same is going true for the superorganisms. They're wandering around foraging for work. They get recruited into projects. You know, it's a much more free kind of approach. So the diversity is key to this, and diversity is the key to all of this. It is the raw feedstock of evolutionary potential. It's a raw feedstock of all life. And here is an example. This is a local example where I live in San Diego, that these water fleas, they live in these ephemeral pools. And so in the summer, you know, the pools dry up, but when the rains come, these little eggs hatch and they just go to work like crazy. And they're all females, they're all clones, and they just eat and eat and eat. And that's what they do. But when the water starts to heat up and dry up and the food disappears, they switch to sex. They start making males. They start having sex and cross-fertilizing, creating diversity. And so, you know, that's our agile route. When you need to change, you need more diversity, because that's the potential of what's available to you. So how do they do that? They increase it through exchange and recombination. And so this is an ant colony. What they do when the rains come, the perfect rains, they do these nuptial dances. So the virgin queens all fly to the air into one place, and all the drones in the neighborhood fly to that place, and they're having a mating frenzy. But the queens, these virgin queens, they have to mate with 6 different males to have enough diversity to maintain their colonies. And we see, you know, like in bees, this colony collapse disorder, a lot of that is due to this loss of diversity. And the other bees just disappear because they know the diversity is not there for the colony to survive. And like we said, that other part is that diverse belonging. It's not just a matter of being diverse, but you have to feel like you belong. This is a terrifying picture. And the shared purpose. And then the equitable sharing of work and wealth. Because why would you do something that someone else gets all the benefits from? You know, that starts to be parasitic. So here we go. We're moving into resilience now, because, okay, agility is great, but there's more to it than that. You know, really, we were looking for more than agility, I think. We're looking for a certain layer of resilience and adaptability. So how can we take that to a higher level? And you can see with this team of teams structure that these superorganisms use, it keeps them modular and flexibly linked and right-sized and multi-purpose and redundant. And that gives them the resilience to deal with all kinds of situations. So that's another key to their long-term adaptability. Naturally resilient in these small units. And if you think about that, you know, here we are designing the Walmart way. It's all one size fits all. It's, you know, it's going back to that extraction of choosing the best number and scaling up to that. But in reality, in life, in real life, life grows in these little cells and little patches, and it is structured. So, and that is naturally resilient. So that's adaptability. Those come from those things. And we also think about, you know, if you've been in a situation where it is agile, where you're working with people and there's a flow, there's this natural flow, and it feels like you tapped into something, you know, and that's really the way life works. It's a dance, and all these individuals of different species are exchanging They're exchanging their abilities, their energy, their matter, all kinds of things. So it's really a matter of flow. And so here's an example from biomimicry. This is Pax Scientific, and this is Jay Harmon's work. And he was an Australian surfer. And as a kid, he spent a lot of time in the water, and he saw that energy seemed to flow in these spirals everywhere. He saw waves going this way, saw shells going this way, and the flow of kelp and all of this. And so he thought there must be something to that. So what he did, he actually froze a whirlpool and created a fan from it. And then some impellers and a variety of things that stir. And it turns out that these are now, with the many iterations he's done, 85% quieter and more efficient than the fans we've been using. And of course, fans are everywhere. And so this is a major breakthrough. But what he found is that by studying the flows of living things and the flows of our world, we can design much better, because these are much more effective, efficient processes. So you start thinking about this flow. And so 85% improvement, this is the same kind of thing that's going on in every aspect of our lives. We're losing this much potential because we're designing through something instead of with the flow. So you can see that in our organizations too, how much we lose through this control process that we do. I mean, it's hard to let go of the control because of the uncertainty, but the flow itself is, possibly 85% more effective and efficient. So what it really comes down to is this potential energy. And physicists are always talking about this, that there is some energy in the system that wants to become, a rock on top of a mountain, it wants to roll down. And so it contains that potential energy. And so that's what living things are always doing, is looking for potential energy and surfing for free on it. And that is like, the impellers and these things, is they are actually looking for ways to flow for free. And that's the kind of thing we can be doing as well. So here's one example with other superorganisms. So here are these Namibian termite mounds. These are amazing. These little termites make these mounds, and they might be 30 feet tall. And they are actually their air conditioners. The actual colony lives way below. But what they're able to do is, this is the Kalahari. It's very extreme weather, super hot in the day, freezing at night. But they manage to keep these things within 1 degree Celsius all year long, all day long. And they use, it's all passive. And so here we are trying to do the same thing in our cities, and it's taking 20% of the world's energy to do the same thing. So, and that's that 85% we're leaving on the table all the time. And the same is true in our organizations with the way that we're designing. So now we get into, we've got agility, effective, nimble, effective sense and response. And we've got resilience, which requires adaptability in general, capabilities. But now, if you really want to take it further, you start thinking about proactive measures of like, what can I do to change what's going to happen? Or what can I do to, innovate? We're always looking for innovation in companies. But what novelty can I add to the system that creates value? So this becomes very important. But when you look at the way that life does this, it's quite different from our own, where we're going, oh no, there's a problem, I need to fix it. I create a patch for it and I stick it on there. And so we're getting these rickety patchwork systems that have lost their flexibility because of regulations. They're all fixed. There's no play in the system. So, and we have this idea of evolution as survival of the fittest, right? But in reality, life is avoiding wasting energy and life on competition. So these are these walking palms in Panama. And if they lose the light above them, they just walk away. They walk to another little patch. So they're actually avoiding it. They don't fight to keep their patch. They just, go to the lowest hanging fruit, right? And so how does that work? It really comes to the amount of diversity that is available. And so here's how this works. We know that, it's not like Noah's Ark with two perfect animals of each kind. It's populations of diverse individuals, and they can be very different. Selection is occurring, some of them are getting eaten more often than others, and the whole population shifts one way or another from that relationship. And then what happens, like these are Darwin's finches, by them pursuing and avoiding competition, they're actually diversifying. They're becoming more and more different and unique to avoid wasting the energy on competition. And that's how evolution occurs. So we can apply these kind of deep patterns to our work to design for potential. So I like this image. This is a family tree, let's evolution. And we have, at any one time, we have all of these possibilities going on, but one of them might explode into a whole new bunch of possibilities. And so we want to be there. We want to be in that spot, finding that one thing that explodes into a radiation of new possibility. And that's that designing for potential, what could be. And a lot of times that's partnerships, that's working with relationships. So what life does, it's not solving problems, it's finding the next open door. And you can see this kind of process fractally on our world, like water rolls downhill, and it's the same thing in everything we do. So what happens is, as these organisms become more and more unique and specialized to their roles, but they still have the same needs, right? So they end up exchanging with others. So, let's say I'm a bee and you're a flower. We need to work together for both of us. I pollinate your flowers, and you feed my colony. And so organisms are actually investing in each other all the time for this reason. And they have to grow trust and capability to do that. So this potential-oriented design versus problem fixing is what grows our capabilities and grows possible futures. And it creates these radiations of possibilities and grows the opportunity space for a wide variety of organisms. So in here you see the fungal networks underground. Originally, plants couldn't really get onto land because they had these feeble roots. And so the fungal networks underground actually partnered with them and enhanced their root system so that they could go onto the earth. And now look, 95% of the plants on earth are supported by this relationship. So this is really the foundation of all the abundance on our earth, is these kinds of processes of exchange and investment in that exchange. So it's these generous assumptions that grow life's abundance. And of course, we can't work this way because we all have different salaries. We all have different, competing for promotions and these kind of things. So this is difficult for us, and yet it's our nature. So I was talking to maybe Vern Harnish. He's the scale up guy, but he was I gave this presentation to him, and he said, well, but isn't the leopard a problem for the gazelle? Does life really not solve problems? So we talked a lot about this, but if you think about it, the leopard is shaping the gazelle and the gazelle is shaping the leopard. Because if we were to keep the leopard, if we were just to hand him gazelles on a platter, he would become fat and lazy and no longer be a leopard. The same is true for the gazelle. If we were to put them in a cage and keep them safe, They would get fat and lazy and they wouldn't do gazelle anymore. So both would decline and degrade, and the whole system would decline and degrade. So it is shifting your perspective from that of the gazelle or the leopard and looking at the whole system. That lets you see how we are shaping each other and honing each other's capabilities and really investing in each other. So life is always growing these conditions conducive to life. So what are the 3 things that life requires to increase this potential? So there's 3 things. It's diversity. It's got to grow the diversity because you can't create something new. You need those a body of diverse mutations and variations for selection to act on. And you need that exchange. There's got to be exchange going. And what's that require? Well, it requires trust. And that is capability, reliability, and reciprocity, like fairness in your exchanges. So these things are always going on. And then the third is the opportunity, is that they're investing in their partners in order to grow the opportunity space for their own offspring in the future. That's how life's working. So here we go. Here's these 3 things they need. The diversity is the limiting factor. The amount of diversity you have determines how much change and how rapidly it can occur. So it's foundation. And the exchange, again, has to be capable, reliable, and reciprocal. And then the opportunity space. All these animals are looking for food or shelter or mates or partners, just as we are. So these are the things that living creatures are investing in for each other all the time. So I would ask your listeners, to think about some of these things in your own work. Is what's restraining diversity and its expression in your work and in your organization? And what results from that? What do you see happening because of that? And then you can also think about what would it take to increase that diversity and its expression? And what would it look like if it was reduced? What would you lose? And so you can be thinking about those things. And then exchange. You can be thinking about what is restraining exchange in your organization. So what's restraining it between individuals and departments and disciplines and stakeholders? And what are the results of that? A lot of times we're seeing hoarding of information, we're seeing silos, we're seeing communication breakdowns between different disciplines, all those things. And so what results? And then again, what would that look like if we were to increase or reduce it? And what would happen from that? So this can give you a little bit of broader view on increasing potential for transformation. And then the third one is opportunity. So here's how living things are working. So this is from Glacier Bay in Alaska. And what happens here is this glacier has been receding, climate change. And so what it's doing is scraping the ground. And so it's bare ground. It's just rocks. So first off, the little lichens come in and mosses, and they're actually creating soil. And so now some annual weeds blow in and they can make a living in that soil, but there's not a lot of infrastructure in there. There's not a lot there. So as they start increasing the capability of this place, now perennial weeds and grasses can come in, and that's really stabilizing the soil. And then you see the fungal networks are coming in and providing infrastructure that's tying all these organisms together. So then shrubs are coming in, and then they're like act as nurse plants for larger things. So now trees are coming in. And if you were to keep doing this, like in a place like, in the temperate forests, you get these monocrops of all pines or all one kind, and they're very tall. And that's a mature ecosystem for that place. So one of our specializations is disturbance and innovation. So we do things, and our ancestors do things to create more potential, and they actually just make disturbances that generate it. So you have to know your nature and purpose and know your context if you want to grow into these unique roles. And when you do, like this is a coral reef. So the coral is a coral animal and it partners with an algae. So the algae creates the sugar, photosynthesis, and the coral's creating a home for it. And they work together. And that has created all of the coral reef abundance. And so we see this in every ecosystem on the earth, is this diversity and these systems, and they're all feeding each other. And together it's growing the opportunity space for more species to find more ways to make a living in it. And you can think of these guilds, which sometimes we talk about stakeholder capitalism. And this is really getting at this, is all these different creatures are taking on different roles in the environment, and they're all needed. And so we can actually start growing guilds of stakeholders that share a purpose, and that can really increase the capability in our systems. So here's one I love. This is called the adaptive cycle. And I use this a lot with companies, big companies that have a lot of projects going, but also in communities or industries where you have a lot of players. So what you see in any environment is that these low investment opportunists come in first. So if you think about that Glacier Bay example, this fairground, so these little opportunists are coming in and doing what they can. And pretty soon, more things are coming in. And that's paving the way for these longer term investors that are, creating infrastructure. Well, what happens is these trees get bigger and block out the sun, and there's no more space for seedlings. So resources are locked up. And you can think of, like college graduates coming out in a recession. Like there's just simply no opportunity for them to get started. So what's required is disturbance. So like the Native Americans and the Australian Aborigines, they're using controlled burns to open up new space. And they were doing that consistently to create these patchworks of opportunity. And elephants and beavers do this too. And the elephants were actually knocking over trees, and they created that savanna that our ancestors expanded into. So you in your work, you can be thinking about this. It's like, where is my project at? Where is my company at in an ecosystem? What is the ecosystem of my industry? And what state are we in? What states are our different patches in? And so how can we increase that? So sometimes you need more adaptability, sometimes you need more creativity, but sometimes you need more efficiency and resilience. So both are happening all the time. And what these ecosystems do is they just do little patches in different states so that organisms can move between them and they can enjoy all of those possibilities. Increases diversity of possibility. So what's required for all of this is equitable sharing and trust. But we are kind of prevented from this because, look, we are competing for salaries. We're competing for promotions. Even in grade school, we're competing for grades. And then we're also so limited. We've got report lines, our information silos. We don't really have a sense of we. Who's we? And then because of that, we don't even see each other and develop each other. So if you think about like foraging societies, they would wait for the kids to grow up and say, oh, I see this amazing thing in you. And then they would develop that. And then you would be initiated into the rights and responsibilities of that society. And that's the way that human beings like to work. But we've erased all this in our companies. So we don't really have those ways of preserving psychological safety or growing trust, or we really just don't have those structures. So trust becomes super important. And like we said, it's the complementarity, the capability, and the reliability, and the reciprocity of the individuals. So we can look in our own organizations and say that, where is exchange between all these different individuals and departments and disciplines and stakeholders? Where is that being restrained by the lack of capability, or the lack of reciprocity, or the lack of reliability? And we can invest in our partners to increase that. And that's something we don't really think about, but that's like the stakeholder capital, where we can really start to be thinking about creating super organisms out of industries and ecosystems. And so it's very hard for us to do this work currently because we don't have the information and belonging and permission. We don't have the recognition. We might lack the experience. We don't have the mentors. Certainly, there's no space for imagination in so many of our work. It can be crushing. We lack the agency and belonging and hope and interest that we need to make these big changes. And why? It's because we can't have an effect. It's that hierarchical system and the freezing of nodes through all the regulations and rules that we put on. So there's no play. We can't make any difference. So why try? And so it actually gets to something more fundamental that I think is really, really fascinating. So we've looked at this general framework, and we can be thinking about this in any organization of what are the relationships between these things, and how can we increase them by thinking about them. And that's a lot of the consulting work I do is around this. But now here's what happens. All superorganisms, because they have this abundance, they have this abundant wealth, they are super susceptible to parasites. So parasites are coming in, and they use deception to do that. They actually will use propaganda pheromones to trick the colony into thinking they're being attacked, and they go around in circles, and the parasitic queen just dives down into the nursery and eats all the young. Or even worse, grabs onto the host queen, sterilizes her, and the workers keep feeding her and helping her produce her own eggs, and then the whole colony takes care of them. So what this is doing is they have taken over this swarm creativity and basically imposing host labor. So it turns that because they don't really want the members, the parasitized members, to think for themselves. They just want them to bring them these raw resources straight to the parasite. So you can see this whole superorganism pentat has collapsed. So they don't want anyone to think for themselves, for sure. They don't want any independence. So efficiency, you want to restrict that and tell people what to do. But you can see now that this has really damaged the shared identity. But what happens now is that because there's no interest in caring for these symbionts and replenishing these nutrients, the waste starts to accumulate, and then the raw resources disappear. And then the parasite moves on, to another colony or another planet or whatever. So this is a really kind of awakener, I think, looking at this, because it's so similar to our lives and in the processes that we're, dealing with. So I think we're looking at having a parasitized mindset that we need to counter in our lives and work. So what has to change? And it's the systems, it's the structures, it's the processes. Rehumanizing life and work so that we can be the adaptive humans that we're meant to be. And a lot of that comes down to our sovereignty, our independent thought, and freedom of action. And so that's what we're trying to get more of in our organizations. But it's interesting, if you watch foraging people, they're fiercely egalitarian, that you will be exiled for ordering someone around. It's just not okay. Everything has to be shared. Everything has to be respectful of one another. And if you look in the other superorganisms, they're doing the same thing. So what we see in there is with ants is they roam around in these little trios. That's not always, it's a team of teams. So these small teams are linked. And so what they do is each of these teams has two workers that just go to work. But one of them is a leader, which is more active and wandering. So they're actually wandering around, and they're meeting the same guy that's wandering around. They're all women, actually, females. And so that is knitting this whole fabric of teams into one purpose, one shared purpose, one shared calling. And so this leadership takes a different form than what we're used to. So like the queen, she's not the ruler, but her first job is to gather diversity. And then she makes this pheromone, a royal pheromone, that is like a signature scent that everyone in the colony shares. And then we know that we can trust each other if we share that. So she does that. She spreads it through there. So that's distributed leadership. Her entourage is doing that for her. And then these little, the leaders that are distributed are actually suppressing dominance and inequity. If, like in honeybees, sometimes bees will start laying fertile eggs, which is kind of a violation of their social contract, and other bees will come along and remove them. So it's this distributed leadership where they're holding this space for each other, and they're knitting all these little teams into one purposeful whole. So this distributed leadership becomes super important. And we even see it in our close relatives. So our closest relatives are the chimpanzees, but also these bonobos, which are lesser known, peaceful little chimpanzee type beings that live in the Congo forest, right? Shy. And but what they do, the males would love to be the bullying role, just in the chimpanzees, same thing. But they cannot do it in bonobo society, because as soon as one of them tries to push around a female, she calls for her sisters and they shut it down. And it keeps everyone more equitable. Everybody does better. But we don't see that in the chimpanzees, but we see it in the bonobos, equally related. So this is within us. So I think of this leadership, this distributed leadership, and it looks different in social insects than it does in a male chimpanzee, alpha male. Like, our leaders don't need to know everything. They're facilitators, they're gardeners, they're links, and they're maintaining these commons that we require of psychological safety and diverse expression, these kinds of things. So these are the things that our leaders need to be thinking about if we want to use these social or these superorganism models for ourselves to achieve the agility and the resilience and the innovation that we're looking for. So we've got to start growing and protecting unique potential, which means seeing each other, developing each other, doing that for each other. But why would we do that with salary differences? So there's basic structural changes that would need to change for that. This collective intelligence is like, you got to grow diversity, got to grow independence, and psychological safety, so people feel free to express it. And then really that strength and clarity of purpose is what draws everyone together. And then creating these spaces where helping and sharing add up for everybody. So equity is really important. And that, of course, comes down to trust. So these parasites are everywhere. we know that our best practices are kind of a legacy of parasitism, but other superorganisms are dealing with parasitism all the time. So they have very clear ways of dealing with it, and they're doing it all the time, preventing parasitic entry, much like our passwords and that kind of thing. But they do it in a distributed way. And what they also rely on is transparency. So they make it very difficult for parasites to operate in secrecy and deception. And then all of those kinds of parasitic tactics they're using, they jam them. So the way, like, for instance, we have Facebook with all kinds of parasites coming in, trying to convince us of things, to make us do things. The superorganisms would shut that down very quickly. So here's our, I went back to this. So the interesting thing to me here is we have to bring back this symbiotic upcycling. And it seems like kind of irrelevant in our companies, like what, growing trees? What does that have to do with anything? Or, our relations with other organisms. But it turns out that not only is that done by individuals in collective intelligence, this is our individual relationships between like art and gardening and hiking and, spiritual activities and things like that. And together, this is what restores our shared identity and the shared purpose. So companies have completely neglected that, but they may find that this is the thing that allows them to tap into collective intelligence and swarm creativity. So they don't have to tell people what to do. And so then we can adapt very quickly. But you can see that it's very modular and small. We can't scale up these Walmarts and things like that and get these kinds of effects because we can't maintain the trust. We can't keep track of it. And so the coevolution, with each other and these stakeholder guilds and then also with other species that we depend on is really the thing. It's this coevolution is what's increasing the potential in the future. And by doing that, we can feed all kinds of ecosystems and grow potential for all of us to do more in our lives and work and to be more connected to meaning, things that are meaningful to us and our children and our communities. And all of these things come, from life that you can see all around you. So I hope that you can get outside, take a walk, hug a tree, and think about how these kind of processes might play out in your own organization or your industry, or inspire you to grow some stakeholder ecosystems that can really change the world. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Wow, so much to, I love to have tons of time to discuss much of what you cover. One particular thing that resonated with me a lot is this idea of hierarchies are flowing the way that we're trying to use, right? That it restricts us to be able to adapt because it filters out rather than enrich abundance. The structure feeds culture. Right now, I'm on a biomimicry practitioner research myself, sort of around boundaries and our artificial boundaries and how that looks like. This idea of rehumanize what we do, like human nature. Well, it is nature. Yeah, so many things I'd love to ask you. Just looking at time, perhaps we can follow up in Slack. I know you've been doing like really interesting work as well, like the trios and how that applies from some of enterprise.
Oh yeah, yes. And actually we've been working with like Cisco and trying to implement those into software platforms, and maybe these can get spread, and I hope that becomes the water we swim in.
Yeah, not only create institutional knowledge, but extend it. And yeah, those things are much needed in enterprises. One piece of advice for the audience, some which are completely new to some of these concepts. So if you were to start all over again in the corporate environment, which sort of advice would you give yourself?
If I was to start all over in the corporate environment, well, that would be very hard for me. But what I see is that these things are actually very easy to implement. I mean, you can do it completely apart from the main, from the administration. It can be a separate layer. It can be self-organizing. So you can, you can put it out there, hey, anybody interested in this? And you can start creating your own little trios that are kind of creating another layer in the organization. Because we know like all these fixed points are preventing our adaptation, but we can get around them with informal networks that we have. And so I think it comes to bringing out those informal networks and highlighting the things that we know, but that we don't know we know, because we have so much value in our networks that we just don't know we have. So I would go into the new corporate environment with looking for ways to kind of layer trust and place and regeneration with these kind of networks, like deep networks that are global that we already have. So can we superimpose them, and also I think can we tickle them from the inside a little bit, because people are so frustrated of like, oh, what can I do? But you can. You just need a friend that gets it, and a third one maybe that wanders around looking for like-minded souls, and you can create these knitted fabrics that kind of are like a ghost scaffold underneath the organization. And I think eventually it'll flip because it's way more effective.
From networking to not working the network.
Yeah.
Helen, all over to you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, what an amazing closing session, Tamsin. Thank you so much for your time today. And we hope that this year's Agile Online Summit, has been a blast for everyone. We've certainly enjoyed hearing so many different points of view, so many different ways of working, and we'd just like to say a really massive thank you to all of our sponsors, our track leads that have been so supportive and being able to help us make this happen. They've been a hit. And also to our keynotes, Johanna Rothman, who kicked us off, Anu Goldpold, Linda Aspley, and of course, Dr. Tamsin Woolley-Barker. Thank you so much. We will be back, so watch this space and continue to get access, like I said in the beginning, to the Slack to meet others, or if you've purchased a ticket, then an access for lifetime to the content that we've heard this year, which is pretty cool. And now bring on the weekend as it approaches us at all different times of day. Get up, have a stretch, and we look forward to seeing you next year. So let's do this.